When the user loads the application, this is the first component that we're actually going to render. It's this app component that uses the useAuth hook to render the authenticated app if we have the user logged in, or the unauthenticated app if we don't. So let's imagine a scenario where a user's coming to our application for the very first time, they're not logged in, and so we're going to render the unauthenticated app. In that case, we've loaded all of the code for our entire application under this authenticated app, and it's totally unnecessary. It would make a lot more sense to just load the unauthenticated app first, and when the user is logged in, then we can load the authenticated app. The reason this is a good idea is because the user can't see or interact with anything of our application until we've loaded, parsed, and run all of the code of our application. So the less amount of code that we end up downloading and running when we start our application, the faster that application will load. To do this, we need to lazily load the authenticated app so that it doesn't load until the user has actually logged in and we have a user to show that authenticated app to. So we're going to remove this import, and instead we'll get the authenticated app from react.lazy, and we'll provide a dynamic import here for that same module, authenticated app, and we'll save that and come over to our app here, and then we'll log in, go ABC123, and oh, now we've got a white screen. What's going on here? Let's take a look at our DevTools here. We'll go to the console, and we'll see that we had an error. It looks like warning lazy, expected result of dynamic import call, instead received object module. So our code should look like this. Our code does look like that, but the actual problem is that this dynamic import is importing this module, which is re-exporting all the exports from this module, our exercise module. And so this module actually needs to export the authenticated app as a default export. So we need to change this from export authenticated app as a named export to export default authenticated app. And because this is being re-exported by our authenticated app, thanks to the way that we're doing this workshop here, we also need to add export default from authenticated app exercise. This is just an unfortunate thing we have to do because of the way the workshop is set up, so we can have both the final version to compare as well as the exercise version. Normally in your application, you're just importing your modules directly and you don't have this little module standing in between you and the rest of the app. And if you want to see what this looks like in a real app, you can take a look at the default branch of this repository and see what it actually looks like when we're all finished. So with that, exporting the default from our exercise, now when we do this dynamic import, it's going to get that authenticated app component, and then when we render this, it should go and get that code. So let's take a look at that. Oh, we have a new error now, and here it's saying a React component suspended while rendering, no fallback UI was specified, and we need to add a suspense fallback. So let's add that suspense fallback right here around our UI. So we'll say React suspense. We'll put our UI inside of there, and we'll say fallback. And what should we have as the fallback? Well, when our auth context is loading, we show a full page spinner. So we may as well just render that same thing as the fallback while we're also waiting for the code to load. So let's get that full page spinner from components lib and save that. And now, there we go. Then we can log out and log in again. And everything is working perfectly. Let's take this a step further and assume that the user is actually logged in, like I am right now. And if I just click refresh, then I'm loading the unauthenticated app, even though I'm already logged in and I don't need to see the login screen. So let's apply this same optimization to the unauthenticated app as well. And now we won't be loading any of the code that we don't actually need for either side of our application. So we'll grab the unauthenticated app right there, and we'll remove this. And then let's make sure we spell those two the same. There we go. And then we'll need to apply the same changes to this one as well. So we'll export default from the unauthenticated app exercise. And again, this is just something we have to do for the workshop. And then down here in our actual module, we'll need to change this export to export default from unauthenticated app. Great. So now we're not loading the unauthenticated app code unnecessarily. And on the login screen, we're not loading the authenticated app code unnecessarily. Let's check out the implications of this change that we just made. So here we have the exercise and the final version. So this is before our changes, and here's after our changes. And in our developer tools here below, we have this coverage tab. And if you do Command-Shift-P or Control-Shift-P and search for coverage, then that will show up in the drawer here. And here we're going to click on Start Instrumenting Coverage and Reload Page. And that will record all of the code that's actually being used on this page. So that's what we get for the exercise, and we'll do the same for the final version. And now we can compare between both of these and see which one of these is loading more code and how much of that code is actually being used, which can give us an idea of how much code we're loading unnecessarily. So here, we're loading a total of 424 kilobytes of code, and 50% is unused. Now, more of that is going to be used as the user interacts with the application, so it's not necessarily bad to have a certain percentage there that is unused, but that does seem pretty excessive, that we've got a lot of code on the page that the user doesn't actually need before the page can render. Let's take a look at the final version. Here we have 493 kilobytes of code, and 57% of it is unused. That percentage may surprise you, but take a look at the overall. Here we have 424 kilobytes of code loaded, and here we have 393. So by lazy loading the authenticated app, we've been able to shave off 31 kilobytes on the initial load of our page. Again, this is a pretty small application, and you should see a much larger impact of this optimization in a larger application. The cool thing about this coverage report is that now we can dive into here, and it will show us the code in our Sources tab, and we can look at all of the lines of code that aren't actually used so far in our application. So we've got this line of code that's not used, and we've got a pretty big block right here that's not used. And if you look carefully, you'll see that this is coming from React Router. So another optimization that we could make is move things around so React Router isn't used on the login screen. Something else you might consider is to make your login screen not even use React or any JavaScript at all, if the load time of your login screen is really that important. Regardless, this coverage tool will give you a lot of insight into different optimizations that you can make for your application, and it will show you whether the lazy loading that you've implemented is really making the difference that you think it is. In review, all that we did here is we swapped those static imports for dynamic imports, so now neither one of these is going to appear in our main bundle. And then we had to update these modules to export by default because that is required by React.lazy, that the module that's being imported has a default export that is a component. And just because of the way we have things set up in our workshop, we also had to re-export that default export from our exercise files. And then we were able to lazily load that code and render that within a suspense component so we could provide a fallback while we're waiting for that code to load.